everyone, and welcome to Let's Talk Real Estate, a podcast by the Real Estate Academy. Today, we're joined by our guest host, Leo Falkovsky, a top mortgage broker with Dominion Lending Mortgage Loans Canada. Today's podcast is generously sponsored by Leo. And today, Leo's going to be having a conversation with our HST rebate expert, Mark Purdy. And for those of you who have been into the Academy recently, you may have heard Mark Purdy talk about HST rebates. We're very excited to be able to have this conversation with him today, to be able to bring you more information about the rules surrounding the HST rebate program, as well as the new residential rental program. They're going to have discussions around certain tactics that you can use to claim your rebate, as well as clauses that you can consider to place in your agreement of purchase and sales in order to protect your clients. Are you ready? Let's join in on that call.
Okay, welcome guys. Today we have Mark Purdy, an HST tax specialist. Welcome.
Well, thank you.
Tell us a little bit about yourself.
There's not a lot to say. I've been in business now for 15 years. We've been involved in HST now for 5-6 years, basically since it came out. We actually got involved because we're investors. The first purchase that we made is a new construction property. We asked all the questions like everybody else does. And then what ended up happening is when on closing date, we were told we had to pay $22,000 in HST.
Holy cow.
Yeah. Which is great because I happen to have $22,000 sitting around, as you can imagine. And then I asked all the questions. I talked to my realtor and I said, "What is this?" And he just looked at me with a deer caught in the headlights look. Then I talked to my lawyer and I said, "Can I get it back?" And he said, "Absolutely not." And the reason I couldn't get it back was because I bought the property through my holdco. And I went, "That's crazy. That's $22,000. How is buying new construction a good investment when you just lost $22,000? It's going to take me 4 or 5 years just to recover that $22,000. So I went a little further, talked to probably 4 or 5 other lawyers, talked to my accountant, talked to a couple of realtors. Still nobody seemed to know anything about it. So I called CRA. In conversations with CRA, I found out a couple of very basic facts. Anybody who buys new construction, regardless of the purpose, is entitled to get the HST that they pay back on closing. Anybody. That means holdcos, that means partnerships, that means not-for-profit organizations, it means realtors.
Right.
It means international investors. Everybody who buys new construction is entitled to get the HST back. The only issue is you have to follow the rules. So that's where we started. And that's what we've been doing since.
So as a real estate investor, you purchased your first unit, and this is how you found out about this HST dilemma.
Yeah, it was crazy. And once I went through the process and I put together the application, and at the time, CRA had a helpline. And you could call the helpline and they would actually walk you through almost line by line and explain to you how to fill in the application. They don't do that anymore, which of course is good for me. Surprisingly though, I was able to get my money back in about 40 days. And it was crazy. So then I called all those same people back. I called my lawyer, I called my accountant, I called other lawyers, I called probably 5 or 6 realtors, and they all looked at me like I was from Mars. How could that possibly be, right? They do hundreds of transactions every week, and nobody gets their HST back. The only people that are entitled to HST are people that are going to use it as their primary residence. At that point, I started to realize there's a business here. So I called a number of the larger real estate companies to find out who's in charge, and we've started doing seminars since. And it's interesting. I've been doing seminars now for 3.5 years. And I walk in, and at some point, I think I must have met with every realtor in Canada, but of course I haven't. I start that seminar, I always ask the question, and probably 1 out of 50 people in the audience actually has any idea about HST. And that's startling.
Yeah, it's a bit of a gray area out there.
It is. And a lot of the times, half of my questions, if not more, are all from the realtor because they want to get their money back. But it's very basic. There's 2 sides to the program. If you're buying a property and it's going to be your primary residence, it's like a flow-through. It's like using a coupon. You're supposed to pay 7.8% or 8% in HST on closing, but since you're using it as your primary residence, you sign a waiver. And that waiver effectively says to the builder, I'm not going to pay you this amount of money, and you can collect the money back. So it's just a flow-through. And really, the builders are doing that as a courtesy.
So let's say you have an offer, and on the offer, it states clearly that the builder is building in the HST into the purchase price.
That's exactly what I'm talking about. So what the offers actually say, if you go further into it, and they're all a little bit murky, and in that 4-page document that explains just the HST part of the equation, it says that they're going to pay HST, or HST is included in the transaction. And then it goes on to say, provided you're using it as your primary residence. If you're not using it as your primary residence, then you will pay them the HST because you're not eligible for the rebate, which of course is very confusing for people. Because what a lot of people get, and they get this on their statement of adjustments as well, they get it on their statement of adjustments as well that says you're not eligible for the HST rebate. What we're talking about here is they're not eligible for the end user or the primary resident rebate. It's called the new home rebate. Having said that, they're probably eligible for the new residential rental property rebate. And that's the second program. So the first program is designed for the end user. I'm buying a property. It's going to be my primary residence. I'm going to live there. And I do need to move in. And you do need to move in. And you do need to make it your primary residence. People don't seem to understand this. They seem to think that, you know what, if I just change my mailing address, that's perfectly fine. It's not the case. Revenue Canada is doing a 100% review. 6-9 months after you move in, they're going to start asking questions to verify that you live there. And if you don't, you're going to be denied that claim. Now, on the second side, there's the new residential rental program. This is the program that 90% of all people should be using. This program is designed for investors. This is the program where you're buying a property, you're not sure what you're going to do with it, you're going to use it as a lease property. As long as you get a 1-year lease, you're going to get all the HST that you pay back. Now, the difference between this program and the first program is cash flow. Okay? If you buy a property and it's going to be a rental property, on closing, you're going to pay roughly 8% of your purchase price to the builder. That's submitted through to Revenue Canada.
Sorry, Mark. So 8%, you mentioned 7.8% before. Was that the provincial or a municipal tax, or?
It's actually a combination of both. And I'll explain the math to you in a second. But we're going to say 8% realtor math, make it nice and simple. Nobody can really multiply 7.8, but we can all multiply 8%. So 8% is what you have to pay. But in 99.9% of all cases, whatever you paid on closing, you're going to get back. Okay, and you're going to get it back provided you have a 1-year lease. And what's interesting here is it doesn't matter who the entity is. That purchaser could be a holdco,
an individual,
a partnership, an international buyer. It doesn't matter where they are in the world. They're eligible for the rebate provided they have a 1-year lease.
That's for the investor. Just going back for the principal resident, if I'm understanding correctly, you're claiming it as your principal residence. There's absolutely no HST.
There's no HST.
Payable. However, I've heard complaints in the past where the homeowner would actually owner-occupy the principal residence and still ask to prove that this was their principal residence. And it's like, I'm scratching my head trying to figure out, how do you prove that you actually live somewhere when you really do?
Well, and that is one of the challenges with the new home rebate program, which is that owner-occupied program. The challenge is, quite simply, you say it's going to be your primary residence. Revenue Canada doesn't necessarily believe you because a lot of people say it is, but don't actually move in. So now they want verification.
What kind of verification?
They look for a lot of evidence, and a lot of the evidence is based on a guide that was put out in 1969.
Wow.
But the type of evidence they're looking for is they want you to have a mobile telephone line. Well, most people today don't put in a telephone line. We have cell phones.
That's right.
Right? They want you to update all of your information immediately. Most people, when they move into one of these properties, they change their mailing address. When was the last time you changed your driver's license? Your health card?
Yeah, time of renewal probably.
My health card is still attached to my parents' house that I haven't lived in 30 years. Right? Because I never thought to change it. Your driver's license, maybe you update that. Do you update your passport? Probably not. Do you call CRA when you move into the property and say, hi, this is my new mailing address? No. You probably wait till tax time.
Oh, yeah, you're so busy, you're moved in, and you have other things, other priorities like unpacking maybe.
Yeah. Do you get content insurance? Do you call your employer? Do you call your old high school, your college, your university, your pharmacist? Get all of that public information changed, because that's the sort of evidence they're looking for. And unfortunately, we deal with probably 1 or 2 cases a month where people physically moved into the property, have lived there for several years, and are still fighting with Revenue Canada.
Wow, Mark, that's a huge dilemma. So if you're in a pickle as such, how do you get out of it?
It's not the easiest thing. A lot of the times it's about having the relevant evidence for Revenue Canada. And unfortunately, Revenue Canada looks for you to have updated all this information prior to you closing on the property. Because when you closed on the property, that's when you applied for the new home rebate, right? If you haven't updated your license prior to that, now you're doing it after the fact. If you haven't updated your information with Revenue Canada, now you're doing it after the fact. So they want you to do that as fast as humanly possible. Anything over 30 days from when you file that new home rebate, chances are you're going to have a fight. And that's unfortunate, right? Can they win? Sure. Unfortunately, oftentimes, we end up telling clients that are in a battle with Revenue Canada the best way to get around it is to just file a new residential rental property rebate, lease the property to themselves.
So that's like as a last resort.
As a last
If
resort.
They can't prove it. And have you had cases where this has happened? They did file the report and still didn't get the rebate back?
Mm-hmm. It does happen. Not very often. Typically, if they're denied the new home rebate, and this is the case for anything, if someone's denied the new home rebate, then the question becomes, what did you actually use the property for? If you got denied and you live there, let's try and battle that. If you got denied because you never lived there and you rented the property out, that's okay too. Revenue Canada is forgiving. If you lease the property out, let's say, oops, we made a mistake, and file for the new residential rental program. You're going to incur some interest, but that interest isn't that much.
So, rule of thumb, as a takeaway, I bought a new condo, I'm moving in, it's my principal residence. What are the 3 to 5 things I absolutely must do on closing or just prior to closing?
Just prior to closing, there's 2 or 3 things that I would advise. First of all, update all your public information. So your passport, your license, your Facebook page, Twitter account, your health card, information with your doctors, your pharmacist, your high school. You should be getting content insurance on the property.
In case of damage or whatnot?
In case of damage to the inside of your property or your contents. Because as a landlord, I would get insurance on the property, but not on the contents of the property. And when I get that content insurance, I want to make sure that the insurance provider calls it my primary residence.
Right.
Right? Because that's one more piece of the puzzle. You should order something.
Like a subscription.
A subscription to a magazine. Order shoes online.
Right.
Order something that's delivered to you. Because again, as a landlord, you wouldn't order a subscription to a magazine for your tenant.
Wow, it's almost like you're guilty until proven innocent, and this is your primary residence.
It is, and it is an unfortunate thing. Now, one of the other things that happens for a lot of people is they might move in, they'll live there for 3 months, and they go, I can't do this. And then they move out.
So there has to be a time limit?
You need to live there for a minimum of a year.
1 year, I see.
Okay, so if you move out after 3 months, Revenue Canada is still going to come back to you and say, we want our money. You're not making this your primary residence. Now the question becomes, like I said to you before, what are you doing with the property? Did you lease it out? If you lived there for 3 months and then leased it for a year, we need to void the first application and apply for the new residential rental program because you're going to get denied that new home rebate.
Right. So the circumstance you move in, you're a first-time buyer. Life happens. Unfortunately, you lose your job. You can't afford the mortgage payments. You list and sell the condo, say after 3 or 6 months under the 1 year term. And in that case, you have to pay back the HST unless you lease out that condo for the duration of the year or longer.
Correct. There's 2 parts to the question there. If you buy the property and you move in there for a couple of months, or you hold it for a couple of months and then you sell the property, you're going to have to pay back your HST because you didn't do what you needed to do in order to be qualified for that HST. If you live in the property for a couple of months and then you decide to lease it for a year, that's fine. When the year is up, you can certainly sell the property. Okay? But if you sell that property in under a year, you're exposed to having to pay back that HST.
I see.
There's really only one way to avoid having to pay the HST back. Okay, if you buy that property and you sell that property in under a year, it's if you sell it to an end user.
So it would have to be their principal residence.
It has to be their principal residence.
I see.
So if you go and you use it as a rental property and the person moves in and 3 months into the lease, they vacate the lease and you go, I can't stand being a landlord. It's too stressful for me. And you decide to sell the property, that's okay. You don't have to repay the HST. Unless you sell it to another investor, then you have to pay back that HST.
And how would one know if the purpose is to owner occupy or lease out from the new prospective buyer?
That's a great question. What I would do if it was me is I would get it right in the purchase and sale agreement. I would have that purchaser stipulate that they're buying this property as their primary residence or the primary residence for their son, their daughter, their mom, their dad. Because if not, you're exposed. Doesn't mean they're going to catch you. It just means you're exposed.
Right. Wow, guys, that's a huge tip here from Mark. When you are preparing your offer, agreement of purchase and sale, ensure that the buyer, right in the offer, states that this will either be owner occupied or going to be leased out. And this way, your seller client is protected.
Well, if they say they're going to lease it out, that means you're paying back that HST. So if I'm the seller and they stipulate that they're going to lease this property out, I'm exposed to having to pay back that HST, right?
Yes.
So if I bought the property for $300 and the HST exposure was $24, and originally I got the credit, and now I sell it to Leo, and Leo says he's going to lease the property out, I need to pay back that $24,000. And I'm out of pocket. So we want to make sure as much as possible that we're protecting our clients in this case. Or if you're the buyer or the seller, you're protecting yourself.
Right. And this is in the case of using the place as your principal residence. Now, in the case of an investor, you're saying 90% of the investors will get back all the HST, not 100 or 100%?
I'm going to say that typically 99% of all investors who buy a new construction property will get 100% of the HST that they paid back.
Okay. So the 1% that doesn't, what would they do wrong?
The 1% that doesn't, they didn't do anything wrong. They were just unlucky. There's a clause in the Act that talks about a fair market value appraisal. Okay. If you buy a property and the value on closing exceeds $350 to $450, there can be a clawback of the HST that you paid.
So are you saying there is a cap on the purchase price?
From a federal perspective.
From a federal perspective. And the federal represents what percent?
The federal represents a maximum of $6,300.
$6,300, or what is it? The remaining 5.8 or whatever percent?
Well, the math isn't that simple. This is government math. Basically what happens is if you look at a total transaction, about a third of the HST that you pay is federal. Typically, okay? On a $300,000 property, for instance, you're going to pay around $4,500 in federal HST.
You're saying around $4,500 in federal HST.
Correct. So on a $300,000 property, you're going to pay around $4,500 in HST. Now, normally, you would get all of that back, provided they don't do a fair market value appraisal. And this is where maybe it happens, maybe it doesn't. So let's say 100 claims go in for $300,000 purchases. Well, one or two of those are going to get picked up by an auditor, and the auditor is actually going to do a fair market value appraisal, which they're supposed to do. When they do that, if they see that the value exceeds $350, you actually start to lose some of that $4,500. You lose basically $63 for every $1,000 over $350 in fair market value. So not what you bought it for. What is it worth today when you closed on it?
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense, but if there's like a $450,000 cap with the prices of condos going up in Toronto, is Revenue Canada not going to revisit that value?
Probably not. And now understand that there's two sides to this, okay? So first we're talking the federal. So let's say, for instance, that they decide that you bought this house for $300,000 and on closing it was worth $375,000. So you're going to lose $63 times 25 off of your refund. Your provincial on the other side, which is the bigger chunk of the money, doesn't get affected.
I see.
Whatever you paid provincially, you get back.
And is there no cap on the provincial side?
Provincially, there's a cap. Okay.
Also a cap. And what's that cap?
So the max that you pay provincially is $24,000.
I see.
Here's where it gets interesting. So if you buy a place for, say, $200,000, you're going to pay roughly $15,500 in HST. You're going to get $15,500 back. If you buy a place for $300,000, you're going to pay around $24,000 in HST. Okay. You should get $24,000 back, but if they do an appraisal, you might get less. You might get 16, 17, 20, 22. It's hard to say. It depends what they come up with as an appraisal. If you buy a place for $450,000, because there's no longer a federal tax because of the cap, you're going to pay $24,000 in HST. You're going to get $24,000 back. So the gray area is between $300 and $450. Between $300 and $450, if you buy a property, you might not get all of it back. If you buy a property for $500,000, you're paying $24,000, you're going to get $24,000 back. If you buy a property for $1 million, you're going to pay $24,000, you're going to get $24,000 back. And if you buy a property for $200,000, whatever you paid, you're going to get back. It's just that between $300 to $450, and that's only if they pick it up. And I'm going to say that probably 5% of the time, there's a physical review of the claims. And now out of that 5% of the time, how many of those are between 300 and 400?
Why that specific amount? Why such a gray area?
You'd have to ask federal government. And again, we've got two different programs, so two different levels of programs. So the federal program of $450 is actually fairly reasonable when you think about across the country. There's a lot of places in Canada where a $450,000 home is a mansion, right?
That's right. Not much love, but
there's a couple places where it's not, right? Provincially, it's a different program, and every province handles how they do this differently, right? And in Ontario, we cap it out as the most you'll pay is $24,000, but you'll always get whatever you paid provincially back, regardless of the value of your property.
I see.
So the key takeaway here when it comes to HST is whatever you pay on closing, you're going to get back.
Every dime.
Every dime. In the rare circumstance, you might lose a little bit. Most people don't lose much. I'm going to say probably we have 2 or 3 clients a year where they don't get everything they paid back. That's how insignificant it is, okay? Now, there is another side to it. And let's talk a little bit about this. What if I buy new construction, I close on the property, I never move into the property, and I list it for sale? What happens there?
So brand new, never lived in.
Brand new, never lived in. Best phrase on the planet.
Okay, why is that?
Okay, so here's what happens. There's 2 sides to the coin. If it's brand new, never lived in, and I'm selling the property, when I sell that property, I was not entitled to the HST rebate. So if I said it was going to be my primary residence, I have to pay it back. Okay. Or I paid it on closing because I was going to use it as a rental property. But if I sell it and it's brand new, never lived in, Revenue Canada can determine that you are a builder too. You're basically a wholesaler, which means when you sell that property, the sale of the property is subject to HST.
Interesting. So the way to circumvent that is back to square one. You have to owner occupy it for a year?
You either have to live in the property or you have to have it rented.
I see. One or the other.
Okay. Now, so let's walk that through. So if I buy a property for $250,000 and I close on it and I put it on the market 3 days later, it's brand new, never lived in. It says that in the description. Isn't that wonderful? Somebody comes by and buys that property for $300,000. In theory, the seller should be collecting HST. HST on $300,000 at 13%. So they should be collecting $39,000 and submitting it through to Revenue Canada. But of course, nobody knows to do that. And the market wouldn't bear it even if they did. Right? Who's going to buy that $300,000 property for $340,000?
Right.
Nobody. Right? So what ends up happening for the seller in this case is they're going to sell this property for $300,000, and Revenue Canada is going to come along and say, hands out, where's mine? I want my $39,000 because you sold a brand new property.
So they're going to come after the seller.
They're going to come after the seller. Okay? Now, as a realtor, the only thing you can do to protect your client here is you have to toggle off that HST document that says HST is included in the transaction. You want to toggle it to HST is not included in this transaction. right? So if the purchaser buys this property and Revenue Canada decides that HST is payable, the purchaser is going to pay that $39,000. That's how you protect your client.
So if you're a realtor representing the buyer of that listing and that listing states brand new, never lived in, you have to ensure you put a clause in the offer, HST not included.
Actually, the opposite.
Oh, the opposite.
If you're representing the seller, you would do that. If you're representing the buyer, you want HST included.
I see.
Right? Okay, so now let's look at it from the other side. So if I'm the purchaser of this property, so I bought a brand new property from a secondary builder, right?
When you say secondary builder.
So there's the original builder.
Right.
Let's say I'm the builder.
Right.
You bought it from me, so Leo's the purchaser.
Right.
Leo puts it on the market tomorrow and sells it to Bob.
And advertises brand new,
never lived in.
Right.
Okay. Or doesn't advertise that. Doesn't really matter. The question is, can I prove that you never used it as a residence?
Oh, I see. Whether it's in the listing or not.
Yeah.
Phrase brand new, never lived in.
And let's face it, there's a lot of ways to prove that. If you got occupancy of it on December 13th and you closed on it December 15th, it's hard to say you lived in it when you put it on the market on December 17th. Right?
Of course.
So now I come along as the purchaser. I'm now entitled to an HST rebate. But I'm entitled to an HST rebate based on the original purchase price plus all the extra HST that was created.
Interesting.
Okay, so let's do some simple math to make my life easy. Somebody originally bought the property for $200,000. Okay?
Right.
The HST that they were supposed to pay was $16,000. That would be the rebate amount.
Or 8% of the...
Yeah, 8%. So if you bought it and it was going to be your primary residence or you're going to be an investor and you paid your $16,000, you're going to get your $16,000. That's beautiful. But instead you decide to sell it. And you decide to sell it for $300,000. What's supposed to happen now is you're supposed to pay HST on that additional $100,000.
Wow.
Or collect HST on the additional $100,000. So now there's an extra $13,000 of HST floating around. Okay? Now the second purchaser is entitled to the 16 plus 2/3 of the 13.
Now the 16 that the purchaser is entitled to, that's assuming Revenue Canada is successful at collecting that 16 from the seller.
That doesn't matter.
That's irregardless.
That's irregardless.
Oh, okay.
So irregardless, they're the ones who use it as a primary as a residence first. So whether they use it as their primary residence or they use it as a rental property, they're entitled to that $16,000.
Wow, so that's a nice little loophole for a buyer purchasing a property.
And in theory, they're going to get 2/3 of that extra $13,000 that was created.
Incredible.
Right? So now all of a sudden, as a purchaser, the second purchaser, I bought a property for $300,000, but I've gotten $16,000 back as a credit, plus an additional $8,000 back as a credit. I've just received a $24,000 rebate for nothing.
Wow. So if you're like a first-time buyer with 5 or 10% down, you're almost getting that place for free.
Exactly. You're almost getting that place for free, or at least nothing down.
Wow.
You still owe the other, $275,000. Or, you know what? You've got a really nice vacation.
So again, to recap, Mark, what information or qualification on a listing, if you're a realtor or a buyer looking to purchase such a property in order to be eligible to receive back that HST or the 8%?
Okay, so what I'm looking for, or what I would be recommending someone, is if it says brand new, never lived in, that's
the giveaway.
Great signal,
right?
I'm looking at timing. When did the building close? And your realtor can figure that out for you. They can tell you that the building registered on December 15th. They can also tell you that this property was listed on December 17th. When you're going and you're viewing the property, have a look. Look to see if there was ever furniture put into that place. Look to see if there's plastic, if the accoutrements from the dishwasher are still inside because no one's ever used it. All of those things are good indications. I would probably even go further and have it stipulated right on the purchase and sale agreement that this is a brand new property, no one's ever lived in it.
Brilliant.
Right? And you know what? If it is, and you're the seller, you're not going to say, I'm not signing that. You're going to go, oh, okay, sure.
So what if there is a timeline and it's a brand new, never lived in for, say, 2 or 3 years?
They have 2 years from closing to apply for it.
2 years from closing. Now, what about the timeline that the original or the second, as you call, builder lived in this property? So Bob buys a property from I don't know, Tridel, never moves into it. He holds on to it for, say, 2 or 3 years. He's been renting it out, but it's still advertised as brand new, never lived in.
Okay. So first of all, he's doing that, he's probably lying. If he's bought the property and he's held the property for 2 or 3 years and no one has ever lived in it, no one's rented it or anything like that, it doesn't matter. It's 2 or 3 years, right? Once you're past 2 years of the original purchase, no one's eligible.
So again, you have Bob who purchased a property from the builder, let's say Tridel. He's never moved into it. It's brand new, never lived in, but he's waited 2 years or 3 years until the property appreciated to maximize on his investment. Does that matter? Is there a timeline involved?
There is. And in that case, it's unfortunate, but Revenue Canada gets to keep all the HST. Okay. The first builder or the first purchaser.
Sorry, Mark, what's the timeline?
It's 2 years.
2 years maximum.
So
okay.
2 years from the close from the first builder is the timeline.
Now, when you say close, is that occupancy closing or final interim occupancy?
Final closing.
Final closing.
Okay. So when all the money changes hands. So on that closing date,
registration basically.
Yeah. Let's say on January 1st, 2015, it closes. If that property stays vacant for a year and a half and then somebody buys it and then starts using it as a primary residence or as a rental property, then they're eligible for a rebate. Okay. If they wait till January 2nd, 2018, so now it's past 2 years, nobody's eligible for the HST.
I see. So let's go off on a tangent for a second. And by definition, you're a second builder. Let's say you buy a resale property, like a 40 or 50-year-old house as a flip, and you gut it, you renovate, you list and market it for sale, obviously for a profit. Does that apply as an HST rebate scenario as well?
That's a really tough question. It's something that Revenue Canada is wrestling with a lot right now. In theory, if I take a resale property or an old established property that's been lived in and I renovate it and I do what's considered a substantial renovation, right? So 90% of the home is gutted. At that point, it becomes new.
So the qualification has to be 90%.
90% of the inside of the house, not including the basement, right? So if I gut it or if I tear it down, it's now considered a brand new construction property. So by very nature, if I take a property and I rip it down to the ground and I rebuild, but it's the same address, we're often calling that a resale property. By its very nature, it's actually brand new construction. And this is happening a lot in the Ontario marketplace right now, where we buy a property, it's an old bungalow, we rip it down to the ground, we build a 2-story, 5,000 square foot home in its place, we sell it for $2.5 million, and we sell it as resale. That's not resale. That's new construction. And the exposure there is whoever sold that property should have collected HST. And if Revenue Canada comes across that claim or comes across that sale, they can say that's a taxable sale.
I see. And in the case that they don't collect that HST, is there, again, that 2-year threshold? Can they rent, let's say they renovated the property, well, prior to flipping it, you renovate it, you get a tenant in there for 2 years minimum or 1 year, then you're good.
Well, you're good, but you're not. So let's say, I'll give you a couple scenarios here. Let's say I inherit a house or I own a house and I do a substantial renovation. I do a 90%, got to take it back to the studs. If I move back into it and I live in it for a period of time, I can sell that property as a resale.
Sorry, period of time, again, is that, let's preface that, is that a year? Is that 2 years? What's considered a period of time?
Interestingly enough, there's no definition. In this case.
Another gray area.
The guideline would probably suggest you've got to live there for a year.
Okay.
But it doesn't define it anywhere.
I see.
But let's say I move in, I live there for a year, I sell the property, it's considered resale. Okay. But let's say the other scenario that you suggested. So I have this property, I renovate it, I do a 90%, I got it, I basically create a brand new construction property and I want to rent it out. Legitimately, I now have to sell it to myself, charge myself HST, collect the HST that I paid on the renovation, and now I can rent it out.
Interesting.
Nobody's going to do that.
Right.
And again, Revenue Canada's got to see it. But in theory, that's what's supposed to happen. The issue there is you're going to lose money, right? I had this house, it's now worth $1 million. I have to pay $130,000 in HST, but I only get to collect the HST that I spent on the development. Well, maybe that was $500,000. And I'm going to get 65 back. I'm out $65,000. And I'm doing this so I can rent the property? Doesn't make any sense. So again, the best scenario there is if you're going to do that, you want to move back into it after the renovation's complete.
I see. Wow, guys, I hope you're taking copious notes here, because the learning curve, even for myself as a mortgage specialist, 25 years in the industry, I'm just overwhelmed with this much information. Just out of curiosity, Mark, how many applications on average do you process on a monthly basis or a yearly basis?
I have no idea. My guess is we're probably doing 10 to 15, maybe as many as 20 a day.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's crazy.
And that's all sorts, whether it's new home rebates, new residential rental property rebates. We do a lot of these substantial renovation rebates as well. But we're probably doing upwards to 20 a day. We don't have many days when we don't have that many.
And how do you charge for your time or your service?
Typically, we'll charge flat fee.
Okay.
And the flat fee really depends on what the product is.
Right.
They can range anywhere from $375 upwards to $695.
Wow. That's a very small fraction compared to the thousands.
Yeah, that includes everything. That includes the guidance. If there's questions from Revenue Canada, we'll deal with those questions. And if for whatever reason you don't get your rebate, we'll give you back your money.
Right.
So it's a money back guarantee.
Fantastic. Good to know. And before we end off, I think you alluded earlier to something called a delayed occupancy.
Do you want to talk about rental guarantees quickly?
Very quickly, sure.
Okay, let's talk about rental guarantees, because this is going to become a really big issue over the next, say, 6 months to a year. If somebody buys a rental guarantee, they have to do things differently. It is no longer just do an HST rebate application. What they have to do in a nutshell is, as complicated as this might be, is if I enter into a rental guarantee, and a rental guarantee is quite simply, I'm buying the property from ABC company. They're guaranteeing me a certain amount for that property. If the market rate isn't there, they'll substantiate or they'll give me the difference.
Okay.
Right? So they've guaranteed me $750 a month for rent for the next 2 years, and the market rate is $650, so they're going to give me an extra $100 a month.
Right.
Okay. If we enter into this, if it's even in the contract, a rental guarantee, even if the market rate is higher, Revenue Canada's decision at this point is that they're going to require you to apply as a builder, not as a purchaser. Whole different dynamics here. So now what you have to do is, we'll go with that $200,000 property. We buy a property for $200,000. On closing, we have to sell it to ourselves for $200,000. Pay the HST of $26,000. Apply for an input tax credit of $26,000. And then we can apply for our HST rebate.
I see.
The craziness about it is it creates a lot of interest as you go through the cycle. So again, as an investor, here's what it would look like. So I bought a place for $200,000. As we know, our HST obligation is $16,000 up front. But then I have to sell it to myself, so that's another $26,000. So now I'm out $42,000. Then I have to apply for that $26,000 back, and then I can apply for my $16,000. It's probably going to take 6 to 8 months now that you're out of this money. And the interest goes up. What we're seeing is, on average, you're going to lose about $1,500 to $2,000 in interest as a result of this. Still a great idea, but you have to know going in, because if you didn't know and you just applied normally, 9 times out of 10, you're going to get denied and you're not going to know why.
Yes.
And now you've got to go through all this process. Now you're probably out $3,000 or $4,000 in interest.
Right.
Wow, that was a ton of information. Thank you so much, Leo, and thank you so much, Mark, for taking the time today. If anybody would like to get in touch with Leo, feel free to email him, leo@leofalkovsky.com. Thank you so much for joining us. And Leo, thank you again for sponsoring today's podcast. Have a wonderful day.